Welcome everybody to the second session here on the economic, environmental, and energy assessment of emerging mobility systems. My name's Mark Schwartz. I'm going to be moderating this session. I've been in the business of doing these forecasts for some 40 years now, long enough to see the long-term forecast come to pass. And it's interesting because until a few years ago, one of the things that we would tell people is if you went back, if you did a forecast back in 1970 of what transportation systems would look like 30, 40 years down the road, you probably didn't miss it by very much. There weren't a lot of surprises. We were still driving essentially the same internal combustion engine vehicles we were 40 years ago. They got a little bit more efficient, they had more amenities, but you really would not have been misled by straight line extrapolating from where we were in the 1970s. All of us in the room think that's about to change. It's in the process of changing. Mary Ann showed a chart up there that had a lot of lines for the various forecasts from her survey work. I work with a firm that generates one of those lines, and what I want to do is talk to you a little bit before we invite the panel up about, what do you do? Starting with a blank sheet of paper, with a blank spreadsheet, how do you organize all of this information on the policies, on the technologies, on the activity drivers, and to come up with a forecast? So that's what I'm going to do for the next few minutes here, and then talk a little bit about what that gives you in terms of an energy outlook, oil as well as gas and power. Because certainly our line is not going to be necessarily the right line, but I think it is a useful exercise to see where that takes you. What are the energy implications of that line? What are the emissions implications of that line? And what does it tell us about how difficult this task is going to be in significantly changing the growth in carbon emissions? So you've seen a couple variants of this today. Fortunately, percentages are easy now because the world oil market is a nice round 100 million barrels a day. And if you went back a decade or so ago, there were many people out there who thought peak oil demand was going to be hit at levels well below 100. At 100, we were never going to hit 100. In fact, if you look at the average rate of growth over the last 5 years, believe it or not, this has been the strongest 5 years of oil demand growth that the world has ever seen in absolute terms. So we are not at that peak yet. Points made by others, if you look at where oil is being used today, roughly 60% of it is in transport, of which passenger cars is the biggest piece, but not by that much. The other road transport, commercial transport, consumes nearly as much oil as passenger, and it's growing at a faster rate. The only good news out of this is the other big piece here is the oil used in petchem. Much of that is used as feed, which means it's not being combusted, which means there are no CO2 emissions associated with it. For those who talk about, direct competition between renewables and oil, there essentially isn't any. If you look at oil used in power generation, it's trivial, and where it's being used is primarily in places like the Middle East, and other oil-producing areas of the world. So no surprise, we focus on transportation. We have, our model is not drastically different than others, not very, very different than what John talked about. You generate a forecast by looking at some measure of activity, some measure of fuel efficiency, and some measure of fuel choice. We use vehicle miles driven as our activity measure. So it's a very simple model conceptually, but it is extraordinarily difficult to quantify. When we think about miles driven, we've got to take into account the effects of population and economic growth and lifestyle. Is the next generation, given the same levels of income, going to drive significantly less than their parents did? The cost of driving, policy, public transit, including public transit policies, urban design policies, and of course, technology. When we think about the fuel efficiency piece, we've got to worry about another set of technologies, the relative cost of different vehicles, another set of policies. What are the CAFE regulations out there? How seriously do we take them? Do we discount them? And consumer amenity preference, because as you'll see in a minute, that whether or not consumers want, as has come up several times, more power, more amenities, more electronics, more size, that historically has offset quite a bit of the potential efficiency improvement. And then finally, we get down to fuel choice, which is a function of another set of technology characteristics, the refueling infrastructure, speed and availability, the capital and operating costs of electric vehicles versus internal combustion versus even natural gas vehicles, and another set of policies. Again, how seriously should we take the threats to ban internal combustion engine? It's very easy for a politician to say, I'm going to ban something 10 years from now. It is much more difficult to actually enact the policies. So, we've got to make a judgment of that. How much do we build into a forecast? So that's the framework. This is how we quantify it. Again, it is a best guess. We run multiple scenarios, but if we were going to define kind of our most likely reference case, it looks something like this. We have miles driven slowing down over time, both in the industrialized and in the emerging markets. That's based a little bit on slowing GDP and population growth, a little bit on an assumption that there will be a little bit of a consumer choice for a less mile-intensive lifestyle, and a little bit it's based on a view that China and some of the other countries just will not go the same way that the industrialized countries have. They will put limits on growth in miles driven, whether it comes in the form of taxes or extra investment in public transport, because if they don't, if China were to go the same route between economic development and oil use and vehicle travel, the numbers would probably be impossible from both a balance of payments and a congestion standpoint. So that was for the world. In the case of efficiency, this chart looks at the U.S. Probably the key striking thing about this chart is just how little efficiency improvement we've seen, whether you're looking at new sales or the fleet in total, and what a change we're building in, a more than doubling of fuel efficiency between now and 2040 after several decades of essentially no improvement. And, this is our view of the economics of battery electric vehicles versus internal combustion engine. People, obviously, everybody's got a slightly different view on the slope at which the battery pack price will come down. But I think the key thing to take away from this chart is that, there is no magic number here. We're talking about quite a wide range of outcomes in timing as to when BEVs are actually economic on a total cost of ownership basis with internal combustion engines. At the top end of that range, of course, in countries that have high oil prices, that's going to accelerate the break-even date. The opposite in the case of low oil prices. So you'd expect Europe to see greater penetration at an earlier date than the U.S. Internal combustion engine vehicles are not going to be standing still here. We'll have efficiency improvement there as well. But something that was mentioned at in the last question of the last panel is resale value. One of the things that we're finding is a very important determinant of these break-evens is the resale value of electric vehicles. And as was noted, there is a very stark difference between the pattern that we're seeing for Tesla and the pattern that we're seeing for others, and that is a key factor in determining the timing of that total cost of ownership break-even. So based on that, we put together an outlook for penetration. Again, similar to what Marianne showed, only here we've got it by region. And, again, given what we expect as far as fuel prices and as far as government policies, we think Europe will lead the way. Those lines are close in color, but the next highest red line is China. Again, we agree with comments that were made earlier that China is not doing this for environmental reasons. They're not doing it for CO2 primarily. They're doing it because this is an opportunity to be the world leader in electric vehicle sales, and that's a very powerful motivator. So we think we're going to see very rapid penetration. in the domestic Chinese market and eventually Chinese cars throughout the world. We think the U.S. will eventually catch up. So, again, is that too high? Is it too low? It probably falls somewhere in the middle of the range that Marianne put up later. But even with those kinds of penetration rates, as you see on the left, if we actually look at the percent of miles traveled, what percentage of miles traveled are traveled by electric vehicles, which takes into account not just new car sales, but the entire fleet, we are looking at single digits out through 2030. Again, this is not written in stone, but you could argue that the next decade is sort of written in metal because it is in steel because, most of that steel is on the road already and it's going to take a while to turn it over. So those are the kinds of assumptions that we have on those, the three big drivers on activity, on efficiency, on fuel penetration. I'm going to come back in just a second and talk about what that means for energy and emissions, but just a quick diversion. Away from passenger cars to commercial vehicles. Initially I think there was the penetration was kind of dismissed. Electrification is not a great fit for long distance, long haul, heavy duty trucking. And that may be true, and it may be ultimately that's where hydrogen and LNG or CNG have their opportunity. But when you look a little bit closer and you look at light duty vehicles, delivery vans, urban buses, there's quite a few characteristics that make them, amenable to electrification. Fixed and predictable routes, a return to the recharging station, an easy target for subsidy, especially when there's government involvement, a lot of starts and stops, good for regenerative braking, and good in areas where local air quality is an issue. So one of the things, as our thinking has evolved, we have substantially increased the percentage of commercial vehicles that are going to go electrification. So it's very difficult to get good data, but directionally we've increased it. So what does all that mean for oil use? Again, not terribly different than some of the points that John and Marianne meant. If you look at that transport road category, that's been historically the leader of the oil complex. There's not much change through 2020 to 25, 2025 to 2030, but when you get beyond 2030, it is very easy, even under those assumptions that I put out, which are not particularly aggressive, we could see road transport growth turn negative. Now, what does that mean for CO2? Well, I guess the downside here is, probably the biggest absolute growth market is going to be China. And if you look at China's average mix, this really should be done based on marginal, but if you look at China's average mix, which is heavily coal intensive, the CO2 savings compared to the internal combustion engine are relatively minor. We're talking about 15 to 20%. At the other extreme, if you had 100% renewable electricity, we're talking about savings of 80, 85% plus. If you look at the total CO2 coming from, this is from passenger cars, if you look at the green piece, yes, we are starting to see a decline in emissions from the use of oil in internal combustion engines. But if you add to that gas, let me say something about gas. It may come as a surprise to many of you in the room, but there are way more gas vehicles in the world than there are electric vehicles. We've got something like 20 million plus gas vehicles. Now they're in a handful, concentrated in a handful of countries like Iran, like Pakistan, or parts of countries that have an excess supply of gas, historically have, like Sichuan province in China. But there are about 20 million gas utilizing vehicles on the road. So you see the gas that's used directly in those vehicles, and then we show how much additional emissions that we get from gas and from coal used to generate that incremental power that's going to be required. Now, some others, I'll throw out a number. In terms of total capacity, the additional electricity required is not that much. We're talking about, maybe 2.5% to 3% additional generation capacity to meet the requirements implied by this forecast. To put that into perspective, we've looked around the world. the additional electricity you're going to require for EVs will be about offset by the savings that you can get from LED lighting. So this is, it's not, now, as has been mentioned, there is a lot of potential here, so, you know, I'm going to skip through the next one. This is going to be extremely difficult to turn the world to reduce CO2 emissions in line with the 1.5, 2 degree scenarios. If you work this out, it's not just that you need more action post 2030. You need action immediately, because we're talking about declines here of several percentage points. When, you know, we've done scenarios, 2 degree scenarios, you've got to find a way to get oil use down 50% by 2050, and this is not anywhere close to that path. So I hope, you know, as we hear the rest of the presentations, we have you know, a lot more optimistic views. Maybe we continue to revise those assumptions, revise up the EV penetration, revise down the miles traveled, because it's going to take a contribution from all of those, including the efficiency, to significantly move the needle on this CO2 path. With that, thank you.